Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's had a good cup of tea or coffee, had a snack, digested the digital economy. Now we're getting into a session on the right reforms for transformational growth. It's a 2-hour session. We want to keep it engaging. We want to keep it lively as well. And to kickstart proceedings, we will have a presentation by Dr. Song, who is the country representative for Asia Foundation in Korea, who will talk about Korea's transformational growth story and a lot of the implications for Sri Lanka. Let me invite, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Song here in Sri Lanka and speaking to an esteemed audience such as this. Dr. Song, we invite you to the floor.
Good morning. Kohomada oyala hemoma hamuviva satutak. Mutana ine eka genamama godak satutu vena. I'm very pleased to be here today with you. Before I start talking about the Korean economy's development history, let me just give you a short introduction about the Asia Foundation. We operate in 31 countries in Asia and the Pacific for a peaceful, just, thriving Asia and the Pacific. Okay, in the previous session, Mr. Hans talked about the forward-looking strategy for the development of the Sri Lankan economy. Now, let me take you back to the development history of the Korean economy, development story of the Korean economy. Well, here's a table of indicators showing progress of the Korean economy. You can see the Korean economy grew negative 5.1% at the height of the 1997-8 Asian financial crisis. One of the 3 negative growth Korea has ever posted. And I know how painful it may be for you to go through this facility fund under an IMF rescue package, assistance package. You can also see a great difference in export items from the early days until today. It shows a shift to an export-oriented economy from the early 1960s and the growing importance of manufacturing. You can have a quick look at the GDP growth of the 2 countries from 1962 to 2023. In 1962, the 2 countries' growth rates were about the same. And as you can see, and in short, the story of the Korean economy was made possible with a right policy and people, that is export-oriented industrialization and human resource development. And it was supported by leadership at the top political and government level, entrepreneurship of the private sector, innovation with investment in R&D throughout Korea's development, and institution building with macroeconomic and financial reforms. You know, in a nutshell, according to the World Bank's development report last year, Korea's development is a story of investment, infusion, and innovation. So before we took off in the 1960s, what was it like in the 1950s? The picture of the Korean society and the Korean economy. Well, the Korean society was suffering from the aftermath of the Korean War, and yet we had a vibrant private sector with strong entrepreneurship. You know, everyone wanted to make it, and they were proactive in expressing their views and needs to the government on economic issues. And there's a series of interesting studies these days showing that it was really the private sector, basically textile industry back then, which kept asking the government to shift to an export-led industrialization from the import substitution policy. That was happening already in the late 1950s. And, textile industry were, back in the late 1950s, they were already producing more than the domestic market could absorb. So they appealed to the government to support their export abroad. And we had higher primary and secondary school enrollment rates than countries with similar per capita income even back then. You can see on secondary enrollment rates in earlier days, Sri Lanka had a higher secondary enrollment rate. But when it comes to the tertiary enrollment rate, Korea did better than Sri Lanka for somehow. And I think, especially in today's world, highly qualified, well-educated workforce is an absolute requirement, prerequisite for any economy to push for development. And coming back again, and even then, the international community's assessment of Korea back then was not very positive. They saw Korea as a country with mendicant mentality. And a lot of American development agencies, probably including mine, saw Korea as a rattle, as an albatross, and as a nightmare, and bottomless pit, and what have you. So that was the situation in the 50s. But then, I think we're lucky enough to have a very favorable and conducive international environment. Although Korea was seen as a basket case in the late 50s, the international circumstances in the 1960s until the oil crisis in the 1970s provided Korea with great opportunities to take advantage of. And Korea was lucky, I think, in that sense. Korea benefited greatly from the Bretton Woods system that encouraged and facilitated international trade and investment. And there were abundant supplies of international capital available at reasonable borrowing terms. And the advanced economy enjoyed good economic conditions, which further stimulated the expansion of the global market. And Korea's participation in the Vietnam War resulted in substantial foreign exchange earnings and facilitated the rapid development of basic industries, as well as heavy and chemical industries, such as steel, machinery, and other heavy manufacturing industries. Even then, Korea was, of course, cash-stricken. So much so we had to send our young people as nurses, well-qualified, well-educated young people as nurses and miners to West Germany. And the remittances they sent back home were well used to support the economic development. And there was another factor that we normalized the relations with Japan, and as a consequence, we received reparations, and a big chunk of that money was spent to establish a steel company, which is internationally known, one of the largest steel companies in the world, POSCO. That's how POSCO came about. So these are the pictures showing some of the segments, episodes of Korea in the 1960s. So against this background, the industrial and economic policy of Korea can be characterized as an outcome of comprehensive joint efforts of the government and the private sector. And it's not just a collection of tax and financial incentives to increase exports. Measures to increase public investment, encourage private investment started with the first economic development planning. In the 70s and 80s, the industrial policy encouraged adoption of foreign technologies, based on which I think Korea later on started to innovate. And tax credits were given for royalty payments for foreign technologies, and large conglomerates, chaebols, led in copying technologies from abroad. And the industrial policy emphasizes domestic investment, human resource development, infrastructure development, and institutional capacity building. And as a result of that, we're able to increase worker productivity. In 1962, Korea's worker productivity was 17.7% of that of the US, and we were able to steadily increase worker productivity to 60% of that of the US in 2019, but it's still below our expectations. And I think increasing productivity further is still critical question for the Korean policymakers and the Korean economy. So if you see this table, it shows an industrial composition of public sector investment. As we go along, you can see there were many more investments in infrastructure and social overhead. We increased public sector investment in infrastructure because infrastructure is a critical backbone of economic growth and human resource development. Infrastructure building often takes big investments, so it requires the government and the public sector's engagement in investing and developing infrastructure, such as roads, railways, water, electricity, telecommunications, etc. Well, that's the reason why you still see, public state-owned enterprises in Korea providing infrastructure services, essential basic infrastructure services, although many of them have been privatized. So I think the Sri Lankan government and the public sector should take a more proactive approach to infrastructure development. Let's say if roads are built connecting every corner of the country, it will reduce logistics cost and time, and also reduce the consumer price, eventually reducing inflation in making Sri Lankan products more competitive. Without infrastructure, the government, businesses, and the people will end up paying more compared to the income level. So investment in electricity is one of the most critical challenges to support rapid industrialization on and modernizing rural areas. And the demand for electricity will grow ever so large because of digitalization efforts the Sri Lankan government is pursuing, as His Excellency mentioned last night, and also Mr. Hans this morning mentioned. And basically, the electricity demand is growing exponentially everywhere with the AI revolution and digitalization. And as industrial policy many export promotion measures were taken. The Korea Trade Promotion Corporation was established in 1962 at the time of the launch of the first economic development planning to provide institutional support in foreign marketing and technology imports. It still is a very strong, solid public agency with offices all around the world. There is one in Sri Lanka as well. Also, exporters themselves created their own associations to collect and share more industry-specific information and services. Exporters were entitled to special treatments, including various tax incentives, tariff exemptions, automatic import rights, and easy customs clearances, special interest rates on export loans, among other things. So what was the private sector role then? Well, the Korean private sector partnered with the government for export-driven industrialization and decision-making and implementation and execution. As I said at the beginning, it was really the private sector of Korea that pushed the government, that made the government change their import substitution policy to an export-led industrialization. So the private sector involved in various advisory committees with academics, press, interest groups, and share their views on economic issues. And they also reviewed the economic development plans for improvement, for feedback, and inputs. And they realized how important, in this process, they realized how important investment in R&D was. So at the initial stage of economic development, the government led investment in R&D, but soon the private sector took over. As of now, the private sector accounts for about 87% of R&D investment in Korea. And out of this 87% of R&D investment, big corporations are leading the effort. And the process also provided businesses with opportunities to review investment prospects for industries. The entire process and the private sector itself boosted entrepreneurship and led in innovation. So, but then, such efforts would not have translated into a positive outcome without top leadership's attention, commitment, and actual involvement in the entire process. So after achieving $100 million export mark, then President Park Chung-hee convened and chaired the monthly export promotion meeting attended by ministers, high-ranking officials, and top business leaders. The monthly meeting monitored progress and institutional innovations and solutions to problems. And export insurance, for instance, was introduced as a result of this monthly export promotion meeting. And this export promotion meeting on a monthly basis had a nice complementarity with the 5-year economic development plans. And Korea, still being a very strong presidential system, such mechanism that the president himself or herself involves still works very well. We had the Presidential National Competitiveness Council in the President's office some years back, which had similar modalities to the monthly export promotion meeting, and it contributed greatly to deregulation of unnecessary and excess regulations. Well, my view is Sri Lanka might want to consider, adopting this sort of mechanism that the president himself convenes and chairs and monitors the progress at each monthly meeting. And this shows how, in our development story, I said it was a story of export-led industrialization and human resource development. And in terms of human resource development, we put a lot of effort and investment in scientification of human resources, meaning that we put a lot of investment in producing good workforce that could put into science and technology areas as well as vocational and technical jobs. So the government involved in expanding technical vocational training and science and engineering education, in today's terms, STEM education. And even the private sector themselves involved in creating their own schooling and training programs to educate their own workers at their factory compound. And the government also fully subsidized technical high schools for those poor but talented young people. And we also created science and technology institutes. I'm not sure if I remember the year correctly, but somewhere around 1962, then President Park Chung-hee met then US President Lyndon Johnson, and he asked President Johnson to provide an aid specifically to support establishing a science and technology institute, a government think tank. That's how the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, which is the largest one in Korea, came about. And you may have heard about the Korean Science and Technology University, which is KAIST. KAIST is actually an offshoot of this Korea Institute of Science and Technology. And after creating the KIST, the Korean government put more investments in creating more specialized science and technology institutes. So we have a number of science and technology specialized institutes at the funded still by the government, by the public money. So this industry, government, academia cooperation paved the way for Korea's transition to a knowledge-based economy, which later on helped us to overcome the 1997-8 Asian financial crisis. So this chart shows how national innovation system works. It is really the collaboration of the government, business, and academia that supports the national innovation system. And this is how it has been working in the Korean context. And this chart shows a deep correlation between investment in R&D and economic development in the Korean context. Korea is one of the top countries investing more in R&D as a share of GDP. And we're committed to keeping its level or increasing it further, because we know how important it is to make a steady and, as much as possible, investment in R&D. So I think Sri Lanka perhaps needs to do more on increasing your investment in R&D, and also R&D researchers in R&D per million people. This chart shows very well, where we should be heading for the economic development and growth. And I just wanted to quickly touch upon the lessons of the 1997-8 Asian financial crisis. Despite economic success leading up to the 1990s, the Korean economy was not without problems. It had an outdated foreign exchange policy. It was a managed foreign exchange policy to promote, export, to support export companies. And the industrial policy of the previous development period resulted in government-business collusion, and decisions were often made based on political grounds, not on economic grounds, leading to market distortions and unfair practices. And the government made a wrong decision to liberalize the short-term financial market before the long-term financial market. And as a result, chaebols were heavily indebted, and at the same time, chaebols owned many commercial banks. They owned about 30 commercial banks, and leading to high unsustainable chaebol leverage. And the economic fundamentals then were not on sound standing. So when the Asian financial crisis broke out, Korea was hit hard, posting one of the three negative economic growth in the Korean economic development history. So we were immediately put under an IMF rescue package, which required a set of stringent reform measures. And as a result, we introduced a market-based exchange rate, and we moved ahead with public sector reform, which was big then. I think the Sri Lankan public sector is oversized compared to the disproportionately oversized compared to the size of the economy. Last night, His Excellency asked the question, why more people are attracted to the public sector? Well, part of the reason is naturally because your annual budget is consumed. 70 or 80% of your annual budget is consumed by the public sector. So people know where the opportunities, where the money are. So that's why people are attracted to the public sector. I think there should be a strenuous and continued effort to strike a balance between the public sector and the private sector. And that's when we started to privatize state-owned enterprises to improve its efficiency. And labor reform, as well as business reform, were also done at the same time. And the Korean government went ahead with fiscal consolidation. Through the banking sector reform, many commercial banks were merged or made to go. And one of the great lesson of the crisis was ensuring the right policy sequencing. I mean, there are so many important things in our life, in your government, before you, but it's the government's capacity to be able to sequence policy priorities right and implement them accordingly. So for all this to happen, political leadership and commitment is of the prime importance in my view. And I often hear Sri Lankans talk about the small population size you have. Well, population size matters, of course. If you have a big population, that means if you have a bigger potential market. But the population size doesn't account for all. In the 60s, when we started launching this economic development plan, our population was about 20-something million, was about the same as that of Sri Lanka. And the population size was never a barrier, hindrance for us to, take off. So, and what's more important is productivity of the population and competitiveness of the population, and also making the right policy priorities, sequencing the right policy priorities. So let me finish with this quote from Paul Krugman, emphasizing the importance of productivity in any economic development in the longer term. With that, let me finish my presentation. Oyata Sudutui. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Song. May I ask you to stay on stage? That was a fabulous entry point to our discussion and the next 1.5 hours today. So let me now invite our panel. We have a blend of private sector and also from investors as well as multilateral institutions. Let me first invite Mr. Takafumi Kadono, who is the country director for Sri Lanka from the Asia Development Bank, to take his place on stage. We have Mr. Krishan Balendra, who is the chairman of John Keel Holdings. We have Ali Tariq, who is the chairman CEO of Unilever Sri Lanka. We have Munish Kumar, who is the CEO of Colombo West International Terminal. And joining us online is Matthias Martinsen, who is the Chief Investment Officer, founding partner of Tundra Frontier. So thank you for joining us on the stage as well. Just a few housekeeping rules. All the questions and answers can come in through the Slido platform. So just go on to slido.com and put in the code 2439072. That's the most important code for today, 2439072. The QR code, I think, will be flashed as well, or the QR codes also can be found on your tables. Put in your questions there. There are also interesting polls that were put in as well, so we can understand some of the critical things that the audience is facing or thinking of in response to these polls, and also those who are online as well can participate in this as well. So keep sending in your questions. They will come to me as well, and let me put them in as the session goes on. So first, let me, I think just to set context for this panel discussion, I think it's important to say we're not going to discuss why we had this economic crisis. I think we're not going to talk about that. I think we've had multiple conversations, multiple forums. We're not going to talk about debt restructuring because that's over. And congratulations to the government for completing that before the summit, so we don't have that overhang here as well. We're continuing with the IMF program, so the government is very keen and intent on it. So I think some of those big macro things which were looming for the private sector probably 2 months is now very clear. But what is not clear is where are we going to get the growth. We have organically grown, not organically, we've grown or bounced back after contracting for about 2-3 years. Now we've caught up. If you look at agri, if you look at services, we are at pre-crisis level. Industry is just catching up. So the base impacts are through and complete, and what will really matter this year is to see the growth impetus. And I think if you don't do anything wrong in terms of policy, we'll just organically grow 2-3%, but that's not good enough. And for your audience here, that will not be good enough for your businesses. So how do we get to 5-6%? So that's the overall context of it. And a lot of people ask me, when you look at this summit topic, what is transformational growth? And maybe we can ask from the panelists as well what it means for them. But I think one way to look at it is on the 31st of March of 2029, when we have to repay the first sovereign bond that we restructured. Are we going to do it by raising a new bond and repaying it? Or are we going to have enough reserves, plenty of reserves to just reuse that and repay that? I think if we get to that point by 2029, we know some things have happened. We're not reliant on the old debt-fueled economy, and we've really transformed in some form or the other. So just laying out the context of the conversation. Let me first move to Taka. I think you're well versed with the Korean growth story as well. So from your point of view, working in the bank as well, any reflections on the Korean growth story and its recovery from the 70s, its resilience, I think, in the 1990s and the 2000s? Start with that.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for having us here. And ADB is happy to be a knowledge partner to this very important event. And Dr. Song, thank you so much for that informative presentation on the impressive 50 years or more, 70 years of growth. Of course, there were some speed bumps along the way, as any country would, but I think it's, of course, characterized by the export-oriented industrialization policy, which was at the heart. And like you emphasized, there was strong leadership and commitment from the highest level throughout. Even if the regimes changed, that continued, right? So I think that is a lesson for Sri Lanka as well. And of course, by adopting this export-oriented industrialization, of course, that brings in foreign exchange, but also puts your companies in a position that needs to compete with the rest of the world. So they are always on their toes, and they always need to innovate and pursue efficiency and productivity, as you had mentioned. So I think these are the characteristics that are needed, what characterizes the Korean growth miracle story, and this is something that Sri Lanka should also adopt as well. And I think this is at the core of this event. And of course, what was emphasized also was the R&D aspect as well, right? So the government led that R&D and also instructed private firms to spend more on R&D. And I understand there were tax incentives given to the companies as well so that they are incentivized to do more R&D. And this is what a government should be doing. If they're giving concessions to private companies or SOEs for that matter, they need to instruct them to help drive these policy agenda, not just give handouts or bailing them out. So I think that's a very important point we can learn from the Korean experience. And of course, investment in infrastructure, education, very important, relevant for Sri Lanka as well. And you mentioned POSCO, right? And I think that is a fabulous story of SOE reform, because as you mentioned, POSCO was, it was the foundation of Korea's industrial development initially, but you managed to fully privatize that after the Asian financial crisis by, I think, 2000, right? And I think you tried to do the same with the Korea Electric Power Corporation, not fully privatized, but I think the government owns a controlling stake, about 51%, so the 49% is non-government. So these efforts have been made along the way. So it's not just at the beginning, but they continue to do that. So these are industrial policies or targeted industrial policies could be good or bad, right? If it's done badly, it only lead to rent-seeking behaviors, unfair competition, and loss of efficiency and productivity in the longer run. But if used wisely, it can be a powerful tool to drive economic growth, as in the case of South Korea. And so, these would be more efficient. These such targeted industrial policies could be more effective if it was, of course, targeted, if it promotes a competition, if there are clear metrics, and if there are sunset clauses as well. So I think these are the elements of how these targeted industrial policies should be implemented. And I think many other Asian countries, especially Southeast Asia, followed the Korean model as well to adopt such industrial policies. So I guess, Professor Mariana Mazzucato from the University College London, in her book Entrepreneurial State, emphasized the powerful role of the state. And she says that the government should not just be spending money, but they need to invest, right? And they should not be just regulating the market, but create markets. So I think for the government, the new administration here in Sri Lanka, I think that is their role, and to do that transparently and to promote a competition, and then also adopt this export-oriented policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Chaka. We'll get into the debate on having a incentive-based kind of policy and how that can be balanced as well. And I'd like to draw in Dr. Song at that point as well. Just speaking on what Dr. Song mentioned in terms of policy sequencing, I think that's an issue that Sri Lanka historically, whenever we've gone to an IMF program, we've done the stability part, right, but not the reform part. We've not fulfilled it, and we've often collapsed because of it. In that light, Krishan, we need to do a lot of policy reforms, but what would be one particular policy reform, policy change that would support your group, which is already heavily investing in Sri Lanka, to invest more?
Thanks, Shiran. I think policy consistency is the one reform that I would ask for. We've developed so many policies around different industries over the years and not stuck to it. With every change of government or a change of minister, or change of other individuals in government, policies keep changing. So if we have developed a policy for a particular sector, it's important to get the buy-in of all the stakeholders, get the buy-in of the political parties, and try to stick to that policy for an extended period of time. Because if you're doing a feasibility for an investment, another within that policy framework, tax policy is important. Just one area that is important. And as we know, if you look at the last 15, 20 years, taxes have changed so often, whether it's revenue taxes, income taxes, personal taxes. And I'm not saying we should have no taxes. Certainly, we should have taxes, but we must be consistent on the tax rate for an extended period of time. So that's kind of a reform that I'd like to see in the way we work and how we enshrine that. Taxes, of course, you could through the Board of Investment, again, not for tax holidays, but the prevailing tax rate to be enshrined for 15 years or 20 years, so that you have that certainty when you do a feasibility for an investment. And similarly, if there is some way on the overall sector policy, whatever that sector, where we can have a certainty over the broad areas of that policy for a period of time, it would make an investment decision that much easier to make. Otherwise, with the kind of moving targets we've seen in the last so many years, it's very difficult to do a feasibility and to commit to a large investment.
So picking off on the point of policy consistency, Ali, so if we see policy consistency and wearing your hat, you're leading one of the biggest multinational FMCG firms in Sri Lanka. You've been here for a long time. You've seen the worst. You've seen the best. We're probably at the start of another journey as well. Provided we have this consistency, what kind of opportunities does an FMCG player like yourself see in a country like Sri Lanka?
Okay. So, yeah. Look, let me start by saying that FMCGs like ourselves and other multinational companies in the country have and will continue to invest in the local, domestic consumption and growth opportunity, and contribute in a pretty big way, both socially and economically, to the country. Yeah, and I can't speak for others, but let me share with you some of my examples, Unilever's examples. In the last 5 years alone, we've invested about 7 billion rupees in manufacturing capacity. We continue to invest about $1.5 billion in capex every year. We invest about 7 to 8 billion rupees in marketing and product and brand development every year. And we will continue to do that. But I think what's really important to understand is that from our parent company's perspective, this is not the biggest market in the world. Yeah, with 22 million people, we are considered a small market. So there is growth opportunity, there is market development opportunity, and we will continue to invest. But there is no opportunity out there which is going to be truly transformational for Sri Lanka, which is exactly what the topic of the discussion today is. The big and the juicy opportunity for multinationals is potentially to make Sri Lanka a manufacturing and a sourcing hub for the global organizations. And let me bring that point to life. And I'm again using the Unilever example. Our global product cost is about $30 billion. Yeah, so we do manufacturing of $30 billion globally. And even if Sri Lanka can get a small share of that, that would move the needle for investment, for forex, and for export purposes. So really, the big opportunity is not in investing, or transformational opportunity is not for investing in the domestic opportunity, but in a potentially an export case.
Sorry, if you talk about that 30 billion opportunity for Sri Lanka, that's 1/3 of Sri Lanka's GDP in today's context. If you were to get a slice of it, what would move the needle? What reforms would move the needle?
So, look, from a cost of doing business perspective, I think Sri Lanka is very competitive. If you take utility costs, if you take labor costs, we are cheaper than some of the other export hubs for Unilever like Mexico, Indonesia, maybe even Vietnam. So from that perspective, it's good. We've got great talent. We are strategically and beautifully located on the map, pun not intended. But if there are two call-outs that I would talk about, the first one would be political and economic stability. For most importers, it is not so much about cost competitive as it is about resilience and continuity of supply. That is the first question people ask when you offer them your country as an export hub or as a service provider. So we've had 18 months, 24 months of assuring stability, but what we need is more data points to build that credibility with the parent. And I'll give you a quick example. Our business, like many other businesses, were badly disrupted for the last 2 years because of the back-to-back crisis the country went through. So I've been, on all my calls with the London head office, I've been explaining the disruption in the country and therefore why the business is disrupted in the country. For me to now go up to them and say, can you invest $100 million in a shiny shampoo factory and turn that into an export hub is going to be tough. But the opportunity is big, so with a few more data points, I think heads of businesses and along with the government, we can put up a case and we'll have the firepower to do that. The second enabler I would talk about is ease of doing business, and I want to share one live example. I'm sorry, it's a bit of an operational example, but it's an important one. Today, we've got the law allows us to claim import duty or import raw material duty-free if it is for export purposes. Yeah. But the underlying or the back-end processes at customs and other places do not support the segregation of containers between those imported for export purposes and those imported for domestic purposes. The process doesn't support it. Consequently, today, even if I'm importing palm oil to export a bottle of shampoo to another country, I have to pay import duty on it. So those kind of sort of teething and operational problems need to be streamlined and simplified. So a little bit of macroeconomic stability, more ease of doing business, and I believe we will have the firepower to take the case for that mega investment or transformational investment that you were talking about.
So we hear you. So I think transferring some of the existing policies into reality, I think, to really catalyze it. And the other part, which is I think we need a story. We need an investment story to go out there and sell. So that brings me to Monish. I think where we will have a story now, I think next month. The West Country Terminal, I believe, is going to be live. The Colombo Port story, its 20-25-year journey to become one of the most competitive ports in the world, that story is there. This is going to be another feather in the cap to advance that story. Talk us a little bit about WCT coming online. What does that mean? How does that change the landscape for the Colombo port? What does it mean for the private sector?
Yeah, thanks, Shiranda. Yeah, it's an exciting time. WCT, West Container Terminal, coming online, and the times could not have been better than that. It puts, it's not only significant for Colombo, it's significant for the complete region as such. This expansion, it strengthens the position of Port of Colombo as the major transshipment hub, not only in South Asia, but the complete Indian Ocean belt. With this expansion, we'll be handling larger vessels, we'll be handling more cargo, and we'll be reducing congestion and building on efficiencies. These are the driving points for shipping lines today. I mean, they want to see efficiency, they want to see congestion-free ports. So yeah, that puts Colombo back on the map. We've been struggling with these congestions for a long time because there was no addition in capacity for last so many years, and it's a welcome addition. But with this, Shiran, I would also want to add a few things which we can do to further strengthen our position. And I'll start with digitalization and automation. Most of the people who are associated with the port and who know about CWIT, we are making a fully automated terminal here, and that's the need of the hour. And another need of the hour is to adopt those digital innovations which are going on, those digital tools which are available, whether it is automated cranes or digital booking systems, real-time monitoring of the cargo. That streamlines the operation completely, and that takes away a lot of human errors which are there. So we are fully committed to that. And that also gives the efficiency and the speed to the terminal, which again is a pulling factor for the major shipping lines. And we can do justice with the additional capacity by making Port of Colombo swifter, more efficient, and thereby we can do justice with the capacity which is coming in. Second thing which I would want to touch on is the overall logistic integration. This is a larger domain than the port itself. It's complete logistic integration. We have seen economies grow where there's a huge integration between the industry and the port. It's coming up in Colombo as such, and there's a need to make the hinterland connectivity, whether it is rail, road, or the inland container depots. Those need to be better integrated with the ports. That will reduce the bottlenecks. That will increase the overall the supply chain experience. So that's another thing which we can do. Another part which is relevant to it is the free trade, the trade agreements which we have with Sri Lanka. Probably we can strengthen the trade agreements with the major shipping nations, both in Southeast Asia, in the Indian Ocean belt, and why not Europe, with Europe as well. And we can project Port of Colombo as a great connector, which it is right now. Also, it's a great connector, but we can leverage on that. We can also collaborate with those major shipping alliances which are coming up. A lot of shipping alliances are changing this year, and we can collaborate with those shipping alliances to bring in more cargo, more vessels, thus kind of justifying the additional volumes, additional capacities which we have. If the time permits, I can go on for a couple of minutes more. Yeah. Another thing which is important from the perspective of the port itself is probably the sustainability. A lot of shipping is going green now. I mean, there's a lot of impetus on green energy, biofuels, and green fuels. So I see a lot of potential in Sri Lanka in terms of positioning itself as a leader in that regard. Maybe by adopting greener and cleaner port practices, which of course at CWIT we are fully committed to do that. But it requires a comprehensive strategy from the government side as well. and also to incentivize those who are, utilizing those green practices, whether it is the shipping fraternity or the port. So that is one thing, and I think we can attract a lot of environmentally conscious clients to Colombo. But all this probably will not be possible. I mean, we were mentioning about Sri Lankan population and the other thing, and productivity per manpower. Dr. Song she was bang on. I think there's a lot of need to also invest on the human capital. I think the future of port industry in Sri Lanka will not be governed by the automation or addition in capacity, but the human resource who's ready to take on those challenges, whether it is investment on the maritime safety and security, the logistics, or the port management as such. We need to develop those capabilities in house, and then only we can give that value added services, then only we can give that efficiency, and then only we'll be able to take care of the additional capacity which is coming in. So with that, I think it's an exciting time to be here, and with all these collaborative approaches, I think Sri Lanka has a great, at least in the port industry, it has a great potential.
Sure. Thanks, Manish. I think a few things we'll pick up as we go on. If I can bring in Matthias, I think we can you hear us clearly?
Yes, I can hear you.
Super. Matthias, you must be a happy man. The stock market is at its all-time highs. You must be booking a lot of profits right now. And it must be a great time to be an investor at the moment. With your experience investing in frontier and emerging markets like Sri Lanka, and seeing opportunities potentially coming out of a crisis, maybe this is a natural reaction from the market. But what can Sri Lanka get right in this post-debt crisis period so that it's not just a high because it's a natural reaction, but it continues going forward? What can we learn from other markets that have had similar experiences?
Well, I think to start with, I would like to take a few steps back and go back to the last global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Post that, both in the US and in Europe, you had zero interest rates for almost 13 years. That created competition for capital. So most capital was concentrated into developed markets, and it was hard for emerging markets, and especially the smaller emerging markets, to compete for that capital. And it was competition. It's not only equities, but also real estate, private equity, etc. So investors in the developed world were suddenly able to leverage their investments at home very cheaply, which meant that there was really no reason to put any money into emerging markets, and especially not the smaller emerging markets. And this, unfortunately, coincided with Sri Lanka building up significant FX currency loans. So I would say from 2015 and onwards, the most common reason not to invest in Sri Lanka was that you were worried about the foreign currency debt the country had at the time. Post the debt restructuring and then the sharp devaluation, these external imbalances are no longer the same. A second reason, which I think was kind of briefly mentioned about issues about making policy decisions, etc., is that you had a very unstable political environment for a long time. You had basically two camps, which one are kind of the famous dynasty, and then you had the other camp. But neither of these camps were really able to take long-term decisions. And I think there's a famous European politician that once said that, us politicians, he meant, we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it. So I think that has been an issue for a long time. And now what we've seen is, of course, post the crisis, post these political changes, I think Sri Lanka has a different situation, which enables new investors to take a fresh look at the market. So I do see, I put great interest in Dr. Song's economic history drawbacks, and she talked about the Asian financial crisis. So post-Asian financial crisis, when you had all these imbalances built up for a number of years, you had those kind of cleared out, which was very painful. But that created a period of approximately 10 years to the next crisis, basically. And I think we're kind of 2-3 years into a positive cycle. So provided here that that Sri Lanka can kind of maintain a stable policy environment, that we don't have any immediate repetition of past mistakes, I think the conditions for Sri Lanka for the years to come is very favorable. You said, if we can compare to other markets, but it's very hard to provide kind of a single roadmap for all markets because every market is different. Sri Lanka has its own competitive advantages and disadvantages. Sri Lanka is hard to compare Sri Lanka to Vietnam or China because Sri Lanka is a democracy and you have kind of different circumstances that you need to abide with. But if I would point out one static which is kind of common for all economic success stories, be it India, be it Vietnam, be it China, be it even further away, Singapore, I would say it is stability. So after the cleansing of the imbalances that we just went through, after kind of now you have a newfound political stability, I think we have a number of years not to take perfect decisions, but just provide a stable environment for investors. And I think that will eventually draw capital back to the market again.
Great. Thanks, Matthias. I think running theme has been so far on the need for a story and, of course, policy consistency. But just sticking to you, Matthias, I think you mentioned we're in the start of a global cycle, which is positive in a sense. But you're also in a situation where you have Sri Lanka coming out of this emerging debt crisis, but the US 10-year, for example, is at record highs, highest in two decades. So there's a lot of flight of capital going on from frontier emerging markets. EMs are slowly maybe getting out of favor. There's a strong US dollar. Dollar is at its highest in about 2 years. In that backdrop, and the need for transformational growth has to come from some level of capital formation, be it coming into the stock market, into the debt market, or equity infusion into a lot of these companies. How do you think Sri Lanka and frontier markets like Sri Lanka can manage in this global environment which has changed? Because 2-3 years ago, if we didn't have the debt crisis, we could have really borrowed low, refinanced, and benefited, but we lost complete access 2-3 years ago, and now you're in a different global market environment. What would you say is Sri Lanka's position on that?
I would say that Sri Lanka's situation is very similar to many of our other markets. And our view, our house view, is that what happened between 2009 and 2022, basically zero interest rates in the developed world, that is unlikely to return. We believe that having kind of a more normal interest rate environment across the world will be favorable for the markets where we cover, where Sri Lanka is one of them, because competition will not be as hard as it has been. Investors will still need to look for growth, but they will always kind of prefer the stable growth, the easy to understand growth. And I think including Sri Lanka has a lot of that to offer. So what you do have after a crisis like this is that you have suspicion. Christian mentioned we really trust what is going on. Can we trust that these are the frameworks that's going to be here for the next couple of years? But I think in generally, I do believe that the world kind of re-entering kind of a more normal period. A second part is, of course, that, which we also wrote about in our monthly letter, is kind of the changing geopolitics of the world with the new administration in the US. And if you look what has happened, because this is, of course, not a new phenomenon, but if you look what has happened for the last 5-6 years, we can see that the US, for example, is trying to reduce its imports from China. ASEAN countries in general have benefited. We see signs of that, of course, in India, but also in countries like Pakistan. So I think these smaller emerging markets in this new geopolitical situation, they're not going to be a threat to anyone, but they're probably going to be a slightly more preferred partner for investors, industrial investors, and thereby financial investors. So I think the situation right now is actually quite interesting.
Sure. Thanks, Matthias. I think just stemming from that and bringing Dr. Song into the conversation, and there's a question also from Slido as well in terms of the potential shift in FDI from, say, the East and Southeast Asia into South Asia. Is that a shift that you're seeing from your vantage point? And could that be a potential storyline for Sri Lanka to really attract more investment coming in?
Matthias mentioned the debt restructuring of Sri Lanka. You know, after the crisis, it will take long to put you back on the pre-crisis international credit rating. In the case of Korea, it took 18 years, 18 long years, for us to get back on the pre-crisis international credit rating. Why I'm saying this? Because it's closely related to foreign direct investment. You know, with your credit rating low, investors will be reluctant. They will think again of investing in countries with a lower or downgraded international credit rating. And of course, this changed geopolitical situation will have a different dynamics down the road. And I think South Asia as a whole will get more attention from the international community as a investment destination, as a way of diversifying their investment destinations and trading partners. And on a separate note, this really has come as a mind-boggling question to me when I was reviewing the Sri Lankan economy. Why is the tertiary education, enrollment is still remaining at that level, less than a quarter of the population? Why is it so? Is there any specific set of measures to improve, to boost the tertiary education enrollment? Because the tertiary education is really critical in supporting the digital transformation, for instance.
Great. So I'll try to take a little stab at answering your question. So, for example, when you have close to about 300,000 who leave school, about 10% of them only go into the state universities. The rest of them either go into a vocational or they go into private institutions, or some of them go overseas as well. So there's a lot who are not getting absorbed in the system, and that's been a big issue in the past, and that's why you're not seeing more investment into STEM, more coming out of universities. It's a broad issue, but in simple, those are the numbers at the moment. Taka, if I take you on, so we heard about Korea's story, and I think a lot of parallels drawn to it. We know what's going on in the global stage right now as well. Are there any other transformational stories within the region from a country emerging out of debt crisis that took on progressive policies that transformed the economy so that they didn't return back to another restructuring?
Yeah, thank you. But before that, I think on the education, if I may, I didn't grow up here, so I don't have first-hand experience. But at ADB, we are supporting the secondary education reforms as well as the tertiary education as well. So we're trying, on the tertiary side, we're trying to help the universities expand its science and technology, the STEM, as you mentioned, education as well. But that has to start from the secondary as well, right? And maybe there's not enough teachers who can teach those subjects in the A level for students who want to go into that stream as well. So I think the government is now revisiting the national education policy framework in order to do that. And I think the Korean experience would be a good reference point as well. With respect to your question was transformation or recovery from debt crisis, right? So I guess in recent history, none of the Asian countries actually defaulted. Korea was at the brink during the 97-98 Asian financial crisis, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia as well, but none of them really defaulted. India, 1991, at the brink, but they did not default, but they were in a debt crisis. But that's when they decided to take a more undertake a liberalization of their trade policies and open up to FDIs, et cetera, and embarking on state-owned enterprise reform as well. So, but now, you know, they're still, now recently they are seeing the fruits of the reform that had taken place. But if you go back a little bit, I think in 1966, Indonesia did default and the IMF came in. Very similar story to here, actually, of course. IMF advised on the economic stabilization plan, provided financing, and then also kind of helped the rescheduling of the debt, the bilateral debt as well. But that's, I guess, 1966, 67, that's when Suharto came in, and then, of course, he was in power for like 30 years, but during that time, the country adopted a more export-oriented, as Dr. Son mentioned, a transition from import substitution to export-oriented policies and introduced more competition, bring in FDIs, etc. And in the 80s, you know, Thailand and Malaysia as well, right? I mean, they adopted similar policies, and that led to, you know, jumping from like agricultural products or garments to a totally different product space by bringing in FDI and the know-how to machinery, to electronics. And like Vietnam, 1986, Doi Moi, right? I mean, they introduced this market, open market policy, and gradually they also what they call equitization, the privatization of state-owned enterprises. Of course, they haven't been able to do all of them, but they are making an effort still. So I guess some data, you know, in the past 20, 25 years, I think if you look at the export basket of Vietnam, and I'm just delving a little bit deeper because I used to live there. The share of export to GDP now is like 90%, right? Almost 90%. Sri Lanka is 20. I think His Excellency the President mentioned they want to target 40% or so. I think Korea is now 40% because it has your domestic market as well. I think export growth in Sri Lanka was only like threefold between 1995 and 2015 or whatever. In the meantime, Vietnam's export grew by 35 times. So, you know, it's a huge difference. And of course, the FDI, it was mentioned yesterday as well, for Sri Lanka is hovering around 1%, 1.5%. Vietnam has constantly recorded over 5%, right? I think even during COVID, they had 4.4% or something. And that's how the entire economy grew. And what they did well was they redistributed the wealth for inclusive growth. So this is you know, of course, the political system is different, but it is one of the examples that, you know, is worth sharing on this stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Taka. So I think one thing that has been talked about is the need for an export industrialization strategy and also policy consistency. Krishna, taking that into account, and the group you lead does have a lot of certain businesses which are export facing, like your tea business or your maritime or your tourism sectors, but predominantly a domestic facing business. What would you want to see, or what would incentivize you as a group to think more to invest in export business? Would John Kills, for example, get into electronic manufacturing? and being part of the global value chain into countries like India?
I mean, we have a lot of businesses as it is, but we have looked at it, and I think it goes back to policy, because a single company will find it too challenging on their own to get into a new industry like electronics, what you mentioned, for export, because there will be some elements in the supply chain which makes it prohibitive. I mean, Tariq mentioned importing some material where the import duty is just too high. There could be an issue around the electricity cost or some labor-related issue or some other issue in the supply chain, and there will be a number of such issues. So really you have to engage with the government, and it is a government, finally, like what's happened in the region, which has to identify certain industries where Sri Lanka has a potential comparative advantage and develop a comprehensive policy on how we can address those bottlenecks and challenges that I referred to, so that it is viable to do it in Sri Lanka. And one or two private sector companies can't do that. We can engage with the government, but there has to be that kind of comprehensive policy, and pick something small. It could be toys, it could be electronics. Do we have a comparative advantage? How do we create that comparative advantage? What are the challenges, and how can that be addressed? And if you look at, we talk about Vietnam and seeing such exponential growth in exports. Have we as a country developed for a single industry, you take the last 10 years or 20 years, a comprehensive policy to make it a viable export? Can anyone name a single business where as a country we've engaged all the stakeholders and developed a policy that would make it a viable export from Sri Lanka? I don't think there is a single. So that's the issue around that, and maybe we are all to blame. Maybe we should develop something, then go to the government, see whether they will clear those bottlenecks. But that's where we need to start at a policy level.
Sure. So in that policy basket, one of the key things that oftentimes we hear, or in my role at the chamber here, is there needs to be incentive given to the private sector to come in, be it tax incentives or other things to compensate for the cost of doing business, or the difficulty in getting approvals for buildings, or the difficulty in your port matter. Oftentimes we've given tax holidays and tax incentives to be that sweetener to get that investment through. Just throwing it out to the panel, anyone is free to answer. Big debate also within, do we need, in this environment where in an IMF program it's a tight box of how we maneuver, we need to get revenue higher, tax holidays. One part says, tax holidays have been part of the problem because there's been so much of uncollected revenue. The other part says you needed that revenue, otherwise you won't really see investments happening on the port or a lot of this infrastructure that has come in. Within where we are in the next 4 or 5 years, what realistically does the private sector need to make that incentive? Say we have policy consistency, say we have a strategy for the electronics industry, for example. Do we then need tax incentives in whatever form to carry out that investment? So I'll let Krisha maybe take it on, and maybe others can.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the relative situation. So if you're saying Vietnam has become a benchmark country for electronic exports, and we look at what we can do in Sri Lanka, we compare our labor costs, our electricity costs, our other supply chain challenges, import duties, and you put all that into a table, compare it against Vietnam, and then still to be competitive against Vietnam, if it takes a tax incentive, then we need to do it. You can't have a blanket policy saying no tax incentives, or yes, we will have a tax holiday for 20 years. It's about comparing ourselves with the competing countries and seeing whether a tax incentive is needed to be competitive vis-a-vis Vietnam or some other country. So we could have certain areas where we are better, our costs are better, and certain areas where we are not better. You add all that up, and then do you still need a tax incentive? So, and that has to be then sector specific.
Sector policy. Any other views of the private sector? And then I'll ask Taka and Dr. Song.
Shall I add to it?
Sure.
Yeah, see, the tax incentives or tax holidays for investments or FDIs, we need to look at from the strategic perspective. These tax holidays are given for a specific period of time in order to, make the investment more lucrative. When we see an investment which is of a duration of maybe 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, a tax holiday of 5 years, I mean, we need to look at not only from the tactical perspective that it's a loss in the revenue for a shorter duration. We need to calculate how the economies have grown, how the investments have come into countries, and how long those investments will keep on bearing fruit. So I think there's a larger agenda to it rather than only looking into one number for a duration. This is how the investments have flown into the countries which have reason to, maybe for Korea as well, or maybe for India as well. The governments need to be lucrative enough with their policies and their strategies in order to attract the investment, and that's probably the need of the hour.
So you're hearing, Taka, what the private sector is feeling in terms of getting the consistency right, some of the regulations right, showing the policy for certain sectors, and then bringing in the incentives. What's the reaction of the bank and learnings from even other countries?
But yes, well, I totally agree with Christian as well. So basically, I mean, as you have emphasized so many times, it's about consistency, right, and certainty of the policies. And like Muni was saying, there is a payback time, right, a period. So you want to make sure that the policies don't change over those times. And of course, you don't need to have a tax holiday throughout the entire time, but you need to be able to make investment decisions, assuming or being confident that these policies don't change. Because even if you have a favorable regime presented to you, if you're not certain that the next government or even during the same administration, this will be turned around, who wants to invest? And as all the panelists have mentioned, there are other places to invest for foreign investors, right? So you need to make sure that, Sri Lanka stands out as a favorable investment destination. And really that, of course, like Matthias mentioned, the macroeconomic political stability is important, but these policy certainties are definitely crucial. And for that, the public sector reforms that you mentioned are also critical. So these are the things that has to be done. So again, case by case, like I said, with the targeted industrial policy, it could be good, it could be bad, depending on how you do it, right? Yeah.
One other critical factor investors take into account when they make an investment decision is the competence, effectiveness, and productivity of the labor force. And I think we really should look into that and improve the capacity of the workforce. With however many tax incentives, tax holidays, if your worker cannot produce, cannot be productive enough, which foreign investments wants to come? I think that's a very important point to be factored into when drafting a national policy. And also, everyone mentioned the importance of government's capacity to draft a good set of policies. For the government to be able to do that, as I stressed during my presentation a few times, the role of the private sector is very, very important. It was not from some brilliant minds, brilliant brains of the Korean bureaucrats that we need to suddenly shift to an export, oriented industrialization. It was really the private sector that pushed the government to change their mindset from the import substitution to an export-oriented industrialization. So I count on you to make a change in the Sri Lankan economy.
Thank you. I think we're clapping for ourselves, but great. Just on your work productivity statistic, I think there was a graph that shows it went from 12 to 60%. And I think productivity is also key in unlocking growth as well. How did Korea really do it? What were the steps that South Korea took?
Productivity.
The productivity.
We're also struggling, to improve the worker productivity. We're still at the 60% of the that of the U.S. Workers' productivity, and it took more than 15 years to from the 50% range, bring it from the 50% range to 60%. So it will take strenuous effort on the part of the employers as well as the government by providing, on-site job training, providing lifelong education, providing continued training and education in tandem with the changes of the economic landscape. I think that's the critical way, probably the most important way to keep up with or to improve the productivity of workers.
So was some of these incentives given to some of these big companies?
Yes, of course.
Linked to productivity?
Yes, for training, incentives for providing training and education.
So if you didn't hit those targets, then you don't get the incentives from government?
Yes.
Okay, clear. The other question also coming in quite related to it from the audience is, the President also mentioned that he's looking to reform a lot of the state institutions, trying to make them more profitable, reduce the loss making. That's a very transformational journey, transformational journey as well. How did the Korean government, when it really had all these state-owned enterprises, deal in managing kind of the workforce resistance, the mindset changes, and kind of even sell it to the public that this needed to be done?
Well, in terms of state-owned enterprise reform, I think Korea managed not to waste the opportunity the crisis provided us. And I think Sri Lanka is, in a way, is given a very good opportunity to push for the public sector state-owned enterprises reform. This is I'm sure the IMF package must have included this public sector reform, state-owned enterprises reform. And please do not waste this opportunity. This is a golden opportunity to reform the state-owned enterprises. We did that a lot during the Asian financial crisis when we were under an IMF rescue package.
So now missing the bus. So Sri Lanka is good at two things. We're good at smiling, and we're good at missing the bus on reform. So hopefully we'll be good at one thing, which is smiling that these reforms are happening. If I bring in Ali as well, I think one of the key parts of this narrative and to become this export hub is the sustainability side of it. Maybe it might change from the US side of it, given what's the new policies coming in. But Europe, which is a key export market for Sri Lanka, is very much on the 2030 agenda in terms of green. And attracting that 30 billion sourcing, what level of sustainability is required in Sri Lanka's supply chain to attract this?
Okay. So let me first start by clarifying that it's not the 30 billion opportunity, it's a fraction of the 30 billion which can move the needle. That's the total sort of...
30 billion sounds nicer. So
yes, but yeah, if you put all the multinationals together and all the global organizations together, it might add up to a number like that. Look, absolutely, it's a great question. Sustainability in our supply chains is now an increasingly important consideration for the importers, but also for the shoppers and the consumers these days. And you know, they are increasingly demanding what we call the farm to shelf visibility. Like many other multinationals, we're also on a mission to sort of be a responsible organization, a responsible business. We've all set ourselves some audacious goals. We track progress, at least in Unilever, every quarter. not every year. Otherwise, you risk talking the talk and becoming incompetitive from that perspective. Look, I can share a few examples of where we are and how we stack up against the region and other parts of the world in terms of being sustainably competitive. So on the climate side of things, 90% of our factory energy consumption is green, it's sustainable, and we're going to be 100% by the end of this year. So that's a tick for us. On plastics, for example, we put a lot of plastic out there, but 70% of our plastic today is sustainable or non-compostable. And in the interim period, until we get to 100% or close to that, we ensure that we collect at least 100% of the equivalent plastic that we put out there and ensure it's safe disposal. And then there's a third pillar, which is really important for us, and that's nature. On nature, 95% of our agri products are validated and confirmed as deforestation free. And palm oil is something that many multinationals, FMCGs use, and by 2030 will be 100% deforestation free there. But a live example for Sri Lanka is tea. Until recently, Sri Lanka did not have a sustainability standard or a code for tea. And we're such a big tea market, such a big tea exporting market. So one thing that we're proud of is that we partnered with the Ministry of Agriculture, and we're co-creating a sustainability standard for tea, which is certainly going to make it more desirable and more marketable for the importers around the world. So absolutely, I talked about resilience before cost. I'm now going to say sustainability before resilience before cost. So critical.
Thanks, Ali. If I bring Matthias into this conversation on the sustainability side, I think one of the key things for Sri Lanka is to attract funds which are looking to invest on the sustainability side. Could be funds that are looking at companies that are sustainable, and even for long-term finance as well. Where does, in your perspective, given you look at so many frontier markets as well, where does Sri Lanka kind of sit within that? And talk us a little bit also about, I know your fund is heavily invested on the energy side as well, and that's a key part of Sri Lanka's global commitments, either on the Paris climate side or our NDCs. Where does energy sit within this? Are you happy with the progress? What needs to be done on that side?
Yes. Well, of course, in our investment philosophy, we integrate sustainability all the way, and that's simply because we think it's a crucial part of the long-term nature of our investments. You mentioned the energy side. I wouldn't say that we favor certain sectors that we view as more sustainable or not, but in our process, we look for three key factors behind every investment. So the first one is the owners who owns the company and the management. The second is that we want to invest in sectors which we believe will grow faster than the underlying economy. And the final and third, I would say, is the key to our sustainability philosophy, that we want companies whose success is aligned with the country's success. Simply because what Christian was mentioning, changing regulations, etc. If you invest in a sector which the state wants to succeed, it means that they are less likely to change the regulations in a negative way. So we call that state governance. And for each country where we invest, there are different circumstances. And I think for Sri Lanka, we believe there is a need for cheaper electricity. We also believe that the country has ample opportunities to increase renewable energy at competitive rates. So in this case, this was coinciding with the fact that we also found a company, a listed company, where we had these other components with management and owners that we were fond of. So I think this is an important area. It's not gonna, when we invest, we look 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ahead. And I think this renewable energy space is an area where I think Sri Lanka has decades of opportunities to take advantage of. So So that's how we like it, why we like it. In terms of Sri Lanka's sustainability standards overall, I think the stock exchange was actually quite early with adapting a certain standard for companies. We communicate with each portfolio company that we own, and we provide them education if they want to. They can ask us for advice, etc., what is required to sell our products in Europe, and etc., and how is European regulation changing. I think Sri Lankan companies overall have been adaptive to the changes around them. So I think they're actually, compared to many of the other markets with similar GDP per capita, I think Sri Lanka is somewhere kind of 2/3 up. So I think that's promising from a sustainability perspective.
Sure. So I think Matthias just mentioned about energy. I'll move to Taka. I think ADB has a lot to do in the next 3-4 years in supporting the government and a lot of policy loans, a lot of technical assistance. There is, of course, a country partnership framework, and you're looking at particular sectors. I know energy is part of it. Maybe for the private sector to understand what are the sectors that ADB is prioritizing, why, and what kind of reforms or changes would kind of catalyze these sectors to grow much more than their potential, or at least reach their potential.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, before that, again, I just want to dovetail on what Matthias has said, and all the panelists as well. But, the historical, the examples that I mentioned, these countries where they grew rapidly in the 70s or 80s, I think the mindset towards like sustainability, environment protection was not there, right? And it could be the case that some companies decided to invest in for example, Vietnam because there was a weaker environment regulation, for example. But now it's totally different, right? Totally different. The private sector are very responsible. In the importing countries too, they want green, clean, responsible production as well, the entire value chain, and the traceability, etc. So it's becoming a much more challenging or demanding environment for Sri Lanka to, start this export-oriented industrialization, but at the same time, as many of you have mentioned, it is an opportunity as well, right? So if Sri Lanka makes the right policies, bold decisions, and move forward, maybe there will be companies and investors out there who will see the opportunities that they can grasp in Sri Lanka. With respect to the power sector, yes, that's one of the areas where we are providing support for sector reform. So, of course, our country partnership strategy intends to help the government to recover and build resilience and grow in the future. And then we focus on public financial management and governance strengthening. We focus on private sector development for green growth, and then accelerating access to climate-smart public services and inclusion. So these are the three strategic pillars, and we have things called cross-cutting themes. One of them is climate change, disaster resilience, and environmental protection. The second one is gender equality and social inclusion. And the third one is institutional, like public sector reform, institutional strengthening, governance, and digitalization. So for us, digitalization, I think we are positioning it as a powerful tool to enhance public sector's capability, enhance transparency, and strengthen governance, as well as access to quality public services. And it's next week, actually, we are organizing a digital public infrastructure summit together with UNDP, with the leadership of the Ministry of Digital Economy and Dr. Hans as well. So I hope you can join that too. But apart from that, going back to the reform areas, oh, and also governance, sorry, I need to also mention this too. We also partner with the UNDP to help the CIABOC, the Commission to Investigate Allegation on Bribery or Corruption, to establish their electronic asset declaration platform, which is one of the requirements also under the IMF's governance diagnostic assessments. So these are the areas that we are supporting. Sector-specific, power sector, of course, we need cheaper and greener electricity, the power system. So we are supporting through a policy-based loan. The centerpiece is the Electricity Act. There seems to be some adjustments being made or upcoming. So we're keeping a close eye on that. We're supporting financial sector stability, where we want to, of course, want the financial sector to be stable, banks to have a stronger asset quality, and also financial inclusion as well. Other sectors like tourism, I think we're bullish in that as well. So we want to support through policies and investment. And there's discussions on, as you may have heard, the amalgamation of some of the parapublic entities, the government entities, in order to, I guess, to enhance or improve the decision making of the government so that the private sector can thrive in the tourism industry. So I think we are in touch with industry players as well to hear from them. And of course, we do have public financial management reforms coming up, and also trade and investment. And yesterday, there was a question on the Economic Transformation Act. So we, alongside other development partners, have been supporting elements of that act. So we are yet to see what kind of revisions there will be, but I hope that the key elements there will stay on track. For example, our focus is on supporting the SMEs to integrate into the global value chain. We have a separate program to help them, SMEs, to access finance. We want to do that for to access to technologies and markets, especially for women entrepreneurs. The other angle is to attract FDIs. So I think in the former Economic Transformation Act, there was a thing called the Zones Sri Lanka. Right? So whatever it's going to be called, I think that idea to have zones, production zones or export zones, where it may be favorable for investors if many of the various requirements have already been ticked off, rather than coming to a piece of land and trying to establish a production point there. I think the Kennedy School's Professor Ricardo Hausmann, when he did binding constraint for economic growth for Sri Lanka, I think he mentioned the policy inconsistency, as you have all mentioned, access to land, and I think infrastructure. So by having zones, maybe those problems will be partially resolved as well. So there's a lot that we are doing, but logistics too, right? I mean, the thing is, it requires a huge capex. We're, for example, supporting the feasibility study to extend the western breakwater. But beyond that, at the moment, we do not have any plans to finance. Again, we have to see how the economy develops, the debt sustainability is preserved, etc. And then we hope to be engaged in discussions in financing critical infrastructure that can drive growth.
Sure. So I think it's clear what some of the priority sectors are. One of the sectors I think you touched on is also on tourism. Krishan, if I bring you in at this point, we're always talking about numbers in terms of arrivals that we want to always get into. I know we have a separate tourism session coming up, but this is a preview of that. I think it's, and then of course there's an ambitious target to get to 8 billion in terms of earnings. Is this a realistic target to put out on our back? What kind of things do we really need to do to get to that? If that is the realistic target that we want to get to.
I mean, it's a very realistic target, $8 billion, because with 2.3 million tourists in 2018, it was estimated we had about $4 billion of revenue. So you need about 4 million tourists to get to about $8 billion. And Sri Lanka, during the years of the war, we were getting about 300,000 tourists a year. In 10 years, that grew to 2.3 million. But if you compare it to the region, Bali alone gets 8 million tourists. Prior to COVID in 2019, they had 8 million tourists. Vietnam gets 17 million tourists. Malaysia is 25 million. Thailand is 40 million. So 4 million tourists and $8 billion of revenue is a realistic number, and we will get there. But if we want it to happen sooner, I think we need to do more. We haven't had a global promotion campaign since the war ended. Now it's more than 15 years. You've seen campaigns like Malaysia, Truly Asia, Incredible India, but we haven't done it. You talk to people in India, they speak about Thailand promotion, tourism promotions, Vietnam, Indonesia, that they hardly hear of Sri Lanka. The competing countries are doing much more in terms of enabling flight connections. We have a free visa for Indian travelers, but it's a no visa policy now in those countries, so it's very easy to get a Sri Lanka e-visa, but still no visa psychologically means more. So we are lucky to be next door to India, so I think we need to just focus on that country as a source market. If we don't have the bandwidth and the financial capability to do a global campaign, just focus on India and focus on the issues of flight connections, visas. Then the airport is now a bottleneck. We all know that. It will take 3 years for the new terminal. Can we build that interim terminal, which can be done in less than a year at a cost of less than $1 billion? So a few things that we need to do quickly, and that 4 million or $8 billion target can be met. It's very realistic. And look at the way the Chinese tourists flooded into their neighboring countries in the last 20 years. The Indian outbound tourism is just starting to grow. So, we are lucky to be next door to India. Targets are realistic. Few things we need to do.
So the Indian tourism story is clear in how we need to latch on. Munish, if I talk about the Indian growth story from a logistics and maritime point of view, how well is the Colombo port ready to attract it? I know there's a lot of new ports coming in South India as well. Where does Sri Lanka kind of fit in that? Can we use that as a big lever to transform?
You're right. Actually, India's growth, will fire up the engines of South Asia's economic growth for a decade or so. And yes, there's no better place than Sri Lanka to ride on that growth story or that wave. India's middle class is increasing. India's middle class capacity is increasing. Manufacturing is increasing, and so are the exports. So probably Colombo, to capitalize on this, Colombo needs to be presented as the gateway not only to Sri Lanka but also for the region. And we have the capacity. I mean, look at Colombo. It falls in the center of major shipping lanes. It is a great transshipment hub, and it can act as a gateway for the cargo which is inbound or outbound from India. So yes, there's a potential, and with the additional capacity which is coming in, I think we are poised to do that. You also need to consider that there are ports in vicinity like Singapore or Dubai or even Mumbai in India. So certain other facilities coming up in India. The competitive edge needs to be maintained, and with the kind of changes which I suggested, or the low-hanging fruits which we have, Port of Colombo can increase its competitiveness and advantages by virtue of solely being in such a sweet spot of the shipping lanes. So yes, that is there. And apart from that, it's not only the port which can get benefited from the India growth story. I mean, like Kishan was mentioning, tourism is a great thing. With the increasing spending capability of Indian middle class, I mean, Indian tourism is just going to blow off. I mean, and Sri Lanka being in such a proximity, and we have a cultural heritage, such a beautiful country it is. I mean, last year I saw a campaign which was like Ramayana Trail or something. There was a beautiful campaign run by Sri Lanka. I mean, my mother wants to come to Sri Lanka to go to that trail. So there's a definite interest which is being generated, but a lot more needs to be done, particularly in terms of the infrastructure, in the tourism infrastructure. I can see a few Indian hotels coming up here, and there's a lot to be done in terms of making those investments lucrative. And I think there's a great potential attached to Sri Lanka just by being in proximity of India.
So we're nearing the end of it. So maybe last reflections from the panel in terms of one key reform or policy action that the government can take tomorrow, which is 30th of January, that can catalyze growth. And for Dr. Song,
Okay.
just for Dr. Song, a special question for you, which is, I think we've not talked about it, but the creative economy. What can Sri Lanka learn from the K-pop economy of South Korea, really putting it on the market? We have a good creative economy in Sri Lanka locally. There's a lot of artisanal value, but we're not really maybe selling it or not marketing it or growing that. So maybe something from that for Sri Lanka, maybe that's another growth lever that we're not really even talking about today.
Well, I'm not sure if I can offer you any good advice on that. But on top of what everyone said about tourism, let me add that, you know, I was one South Asian expert in Korea, a university professor, recently said he thinks of all the South Asian countries, he thinks Sri Lanka is the most beautiful country. So you have the natural resources to capitalize on that. And I've been fascinated by this campaign catchphrase of Malaysia and India, you know, Malaysia, truly Asia, and India, incredible India. Whether or not I have any previous information on these two countries, that catchphrase instantly caught my attention. So if you have not developed one, I would strongly recommend that you come up with one, you know, eye-catching and very appealing campaign catchphrase. And my final advice to Sri Lanka, especially to the Sri Lankan government, I gathered from the talks of His Excellency last night and also the conversation this morning. The gentleman said, we have these policies, we have these strategies, we are reviewing these policies and strategies. But you know, we're living in a democracy where every certain amount of years, a number of years, we will have an election. So my advice is, please expedite the review process and do act upon it.
Thank you. Well, I totally agree. It's a narrow window where, of course, the new administration needs to bring themselves up to speed, etc. But certain bold decisions need to be made quickly, which, as I think we all agree on the panel, that should be export orientation, attracting foreign direct investment, etc. But I think a discussion that kind of stalled during the electoral cycle is the state-owned enterprise reform and discussions on public-private partnerships. So I would, of course, they cannot decide tomorrow, but I encourage the government to resume that discussion as soon as possible. Thank you.
The low-hanging fruit for the country is tourism. $8 billion or more is very achievable. So take some of those steps. The promotion campaign, if you can't do it globally, just do it in India, right next to India, and that's a huge opportunity. Spend what it takes to promote Sri Lanka in India, address the airport issue. That's what I would say, because we can get to $8 billion or more. It's very realistic, and very quickly we can do it.
My short-term recommendation is the one I talked about earlier. Today I have production capacity and I'm ready to export product in a small way to other countries, but my transfer price is off the charts. And it's just unfortunate it's not off the charts because it's very expensive to do business because it's expensive to do business in Sri Lanka. It's because the law doesn't work, and I'm not able to claim import duty on imports of raw material. If I can get that done, I'll be a happier man.
Sharon, my take would be, we need to have one, comprehensive digitalization policy for the port processes and operations and the complete logistic, especially a integrated, unified platform for all the port-related activities, the logistics, the customs, and the clearances, and that can be done immediately. I mean, there's a lot of time which gets wasted in terms of clearances and the manual works which we do. There are a lot of congestions which are there, and those can be arrested. If not 100%, my guess is to around 70%, those can be arrested with a unified platform if we can establish that. In the port operations, time is money, and everybody's wanting to save every hour which is available. And time is also fuel, time is also emissions, time is also linked with sustainability. So I think that is one strategy or one policy which we would want to see immediately as a port operator.
I'm not sure if Matthias is online. We had some difficulty in his connection. So we'll conclude with that. Thank you so much to the panel and Dr. Song for the keynote, bringing everything together. Please give your round of applause. A lot of food for thought from the Korean transformation story, what we should do, what we should not do, what are some of the sectors we should look at, and some of the regulations when it comes to some of the growth sectors that we identified. So thank you so much for being a lovely audience. Great interaction on the Q&A. Try to take as much as possible into the panel as well. Thank you. Back to this, and I think we're off for lunch. So before that, we'll have some mementos presented to the panel.